Hello, and welcome to my social work pioneer presentation. I have chosen to do my presentation on Jane Addams. She had many contributions to the field of social work in her lifetime, and I'll talk about as many of them as I can. A little bit of background on Jane. She was born in a small town in Illinois. She was the eighth of 9 children born to Sarah and John Addams, but only 5 out of those 9 children survived infancy, and Jane's mom actually tragically died giving birth to Jane's younger sibling. But the family was still really well off because Jane's dad was a successful mill owner and a politician, and he was even friends with Abraham Lincoln. He was also a Civil War soldier. And after Jane's mom passed away, her dad did remarry, and that becomes somewhat relevant later on in Jane's life. So Jane graduated college in 1881 at Rockford Female Seminary, which today is just known as Rockford University. And this was during the Gilded Age, which was talked about in one of our lectures this week. And it's the time period between the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century. So with all the industrialization and all the changes happening during that time, women like Jane were becoming more independent, they were getting educations, and they were shifting their roles in society a little bit, and historians now refer to this generation of women as the new woman. So around this time, Jane's very well-off father passed away, so technically she was set to inherit some wealth, but this was a bit of a struggle because Jane's stepmother wanted to pass all of that wealth on to Jane's brother, which was common at the time to invest everything into the male children. But nonetheless, Jane persevered, and at some point she took a trip to London with a friend, and they came across a place called Toynbee Hall. And this was a settlement house that provided housing and other services to poor industrial workers. Jane was inspired by this, and she vowed to bring this type of service to the US. And you can see a photo of Toynbee Hall here. So that's when the Hull House was born in 1889, and this was sort of Jane's claim to fame. It's one of the things she's most known for. I remember in undergrad that we did learn about Hull House in one of my entry-level social classes, and this is kind of what led me to choose Jane for this presentation. So it was located in an area of Chicago that was considered the slums. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of homelessness, crime, and a lot of condemned buildings. Anyone was welcome at the Hull House, and if there was a need, Jane and her partners there would find a way to meet it. So due to the growing industry, there was an influx of immigrants during this time, and many of them were able to come to the Hull House to help them get on their feet in the US. They could learn English literacy, so reading and writing in English. They learned life skills, job skills. They were able to live there together as families. And while the adults looked for work, they were able to receive nursing care and education about health that they didn't have before. There was also a community kitchen for anyone who needed a meal. So not only did this benefit the community, but also it benefited those women who were now educated and were now looking to gain skills as social workers, because without the Hull House, this was hard to come by at the time, as it was still a bit taboo to be working outside of the home as a woman. So I'm not sure how she managed to do all of this, but Hull House was actually not her only contribution to society. She was also a lobbyist and a pacifist and had a strong presence with legislators. She would contact them at all levels and urge them to make changes. She advocated for ways to improve the city, such as adding kindergartens and buildings and playgrounds. She also fought for safety and sanitation guidelines for laborers. She fought for restricting child labor, and she advocated for the creation of a juvenile justice system, which she was successful in. She was on the front lines in the fight for women's rights and was an officer of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, as well as one of the founders for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So you can see that as a woman, and being part of an oppressed group herself, she believed and fought for any marginalized group and fought for equal rights for all, which sadly is still something we're working on today. So while Jane was beloved for her work with the Hull House, she found herself to become somewhat of a pariah in her activism surrounding World War I. She strongly opposed U.S. entry and firmly believed that all problems could be handled peacefully. She organized several peaceful protests prior to the U.S.'s entry into the war and encouraged President Woodrow Wilson to keep the United States as a neutral nation, which he did for a while, but ultimately he did call on Congress to declare war on Germany. But while the U.S. remained a neutral nation, Jane formed the Women's Peace Party and held a massive peace parade in New York City's downtown Fifth Avenue Street. And the picture on this slide gives a pretty good visual of Addams during that time. I couldn't find who exactly said this quote at the bottom of the page, but I wanted to include it because I felt that it really helped me form a picture in my head of just how powerful this parade was. So the quote says, "The silence, the dignity, the black dresses of the marchers, those who did not have black dresses wore black armbands, the solemnity of the crowds, all of these produced a profound effect on the beholders." So how does the work that Jane Addams did translate into where we are today? Unfortunately, most of the issues Addams fought hard for are still controversial today. So here in these photos on the left, you can see another photo of the peace parade that we just talked about. And on the right, this is actually a photo of a protest that I attended and helped organize in my hometown of Pierre following the death of George Floyd. And I'm somewhere in the back there holding a sign that says, "Use your voice," which is exactly what I believe Jane Addams always did and what she empowered others to do. So this protest remained peaceful, but we all saw with the news and with social media that that wasn't the case in a lot of other areas where there was violence and rioting and looting. And the biggest problem with this is that the message of Black Lives Matter has completely fallen on deaf ears with a lot of people because those people didn't want to listen to the message of the movement. They wanted to view the videos of people stealing TVs out of Target and burning down buildings, and they were able to look at that and say, "See, the movement is just a bunch of thugs." And I truly think that if Jane Addams were here today, she would use her voice to educate and to encourage protesting in a way that empowered others and encouraged others to want to focus on the movement itself and not those that were taking advantage of the movement. So this slide is a bit jumbled, but I will try to walk you through it the best I can. Immigration is another controversial topic today. As I talked about earlier, Jane Addams was passionate about helping immigrants get on their feet at the Hull House. She taught them English, gave them temporary housing, kept families together, taught them skills, helped them find work. Today, we have seen there's a major crisis going on at the border where immigrant families are being separated from each other, and some children are actually kept in areas that resemble cages, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight for some of these families. So on the top left here, you can see a picture of some immigrant children that were being held in a warehouse in 2018 in Texas. And at the bottom left, this is a picture that a little Guatemalan boy drew when he was asked to draw his experience while in Customs and Border Patrol custody. At the time, the children were visiting the Catholic Charities Humanitarian Respite Center in Texas, which was a place that they would go after being released from custody, and they could shower, get clothes and food, and that was before they headed on to their next destination. And again, I think this is something that Jane Addams would have a lot to say about. And knowing that she fought so hard for immigrants and some of them are still living in inhumane conditions today is kind of upsetting. So I started to dig for some of the good that we have going on here for immigrants. And that's what I have on the right here. This here is a logo for a place in Jupiter, Florida called the El Sol Neighborhood Community Resource Center. And it's a nonprofit organization for immigrants to go where they can learn English literacy. If they're looking for work, they can be matched with people in the area who need jobs completed. There's a community kitchen. There's temporary housing. And their mission statement on their website states that they seek to improve the quality of life for the residents of Jupiter and surrounding communities by providing services primarily to day laborers their children, and families. And to me, this sounds pretty parallel to the mission of Hull House. So as I mentioned before, Addams advocated for safety and sanitation regulations for workers, and she was successful in that. And now over time, OSHA was developed, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So this holds businesses accountable to have these standards and to enforce these standards for safety and sanitation guidelines for everybody. And that's something that I think stemmed from Jane's advocacy and the advocacy of others like her. So the same can be said for juvenile justice. She advocated for this, and it's come a long way. Most recently, we saw the Juvenile Justice Reform Act in 2018, and this was something that I've become familiar with in my work that I do with the Central Teen Court South Dakota program. So it's a sentencing court, not a prosecuting court. So therefore, youth come through the program and they're presumed guilty of whatever they're charged with. And rather than having to pay a fine, giving them a criminal record, and sending them on their way, teen court actually aims to try to teach something to the youth and teach them about their offense and how it harmed the community or the victim of the offense. And if they successfully complete that program, the offense is removed from their criminal record. And I also want to touch on Jane's advocacy for women's rights. So I added that picture below. This is something that we have so much work to do on, but we've also come a long way. And I know that Jane Addams paved the way for those of us that are still fighting, because she not only rejected the social norm of her time and went out into the workforce as a woman, but she empowered other women to do so as well. And women are so much closer today to equal rights and fair treatment than they ever have been. So Jane Addams was a powerhouse. She was a glass ceiling breaker, and in my opinion, she was way ahead of her time, fighting so hard for basic human rights when it was unpopular at the time. She had a voice, and she wanted it to be heard, and she wanted others to use their voices as well, and she empowered them to do so. She helped people on the micro, meso, and macro levels of social work, and she made a huge impact. So for all of her hard work, but particularly her peace activism, she became the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, and she continued her work until her death in 1935. And I just want to end my presentation with this slide here, just to pay tribute to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who passed away just this week. She was a justice of the Supreme Court who was famous for her work fighting for gender equality and women's rights. I really could go on all day about her many accomplishments, but she was a true legend and a champion of justice and fought up until her dying day for a lot of the same issues that Jane Addams did. So I noticed that Ginsburg would have been about 2 years old when Jane Addams passed away, and Ruth also has a daughter named Jane. So I have no idea, but I like to think that she was familiar with Jane Addams's work and she followed in her footsteps. And here are my references. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.